So Glenn joined Auroville 30 years ago and has dedicated his life since then to its development. His main work has always been in the realms of eco-restoration. Being a land steward, he has spent most of his time working physically in the forest areas, as well as trying to help coordinate the forest group, also fundraise and run the Auroville planting projects. Currently, while maintaining his stewardship responsibilities, he's working on an externally funded project on the present state of the Tropical Dry Evergreen Forest and strategies to protect it. So we'll be beginning the session with an excerpt of Ever Slow Green, which is a documentary film on the Tropical Dry Evergreen Forest Restoration Project in Auroville by Christopher Poe. And then Glenn will carry on with his presentation. Glenn, would you like to say anything before we begin with the film?
No, I think you said it all. I decided to, with advice from people, to first start the session with this Dreamweaver cut. I got permission from Christophe to do this. It's a good way to be immersed into the forests of Auroville. You won't be in them, but you will see them and you will hear them. And then I will do a presentation afterwards to talk about the details, the maps, the technical stuff afterwards. So just enjoy. There's going to be quite tight in time, so let's get started.
You cannot compare Auroville to any other forestry project in the world. It's absolutely unique.
Wilderness is a very important concept. Deliberately setting aside pieces of this planet and let them express themselves unhindered by our activities. Auroville stands out in India because it has been able to protect its forests against all odds.
The Auroville forest is the most advanced experiment of recreating a tropical forest, a jungle. The challenge of climate change, global warming, and all this is actually that we don't have enough forests to balance the temperature and the carbon. This is the point, actually, of what we are doing here and why it's useful for the entire planet, because we are pioneers in the recreation of tropical forests.
The point of Auroville is to be a point of inspiration, and Auroville still remains as a small example of what could be done. We're not a trend yet. We're still an exception.
Forestry in Auroville for me is very exciting, but it's also a little scary because finally you're feeling like, well, you're really getting somewhere and the pressure's never been so great. So there's this excitement, look at where we've reached, but there's also a real feeling of sort of in the pit of your stomach, could we possibly lose all of this?
I came to Auroville in the very beginning in 1968. I was 4 years old. I just loved it because everything was so full of promise and challenge and huge vistas. All of this was the hardest, reddest soil. In the canyon, it was all open and windy and barren. As small houses were being built, trees were being planted. That meant protecting them, watering them in the summer, chasing the cows and goats. Like, wow, we're part of something. We weren't so expert. We were all just really experimenting.
I came to Auroville in 1971 from Australia. I originally came here to see what had happened to my runaway wife and first child. There was a little clump here of banyan trees, which we lived sort of around. Looking west, there was a single tree. It was called a waumaram, and it was 1 kilometre away, across a huge, dry, sandy bed. We used to get these incredible hot dust windstorms. Our only onus in the beginning was to plant shade to deal with this hot sun.
The beginning was quite hot and open ground and was really difficult. Desert, not much green. I'm Kanyaban from Kilabalyam. I was 12-year-old. I dropped the primary school. I started working in Auroville in 1978 in Pichandikulam. I am happy to work in the forest, planting trees. I've dedicated my life to this. This is my vision.
In those days, there was a wealth of young Tamil men, really strong, virile guys. We'd employ them as hole diggers. Those days, we thought in order to plant a tree, you needed a metre by metre by metre deep hole. So we're digging these huge holes, massive amounts of compost, totally inappropriate trees, and spent the whole summer bucketing water onto them to keep them alive.
In the beginning, we basically planted anything we could lay our hands on. I came to Auroville in 1971. I was an electrotechnical engineer. I had never properly looked at a plant before I came to Auroville. We had no clue what was what. A lot of totally unsuitable stuff we planted. Anything that was available just to get some shade. Introduced then at some point now famous work tree. It was only in the course of time that we became a bit more knowledgeable about the different tree species.
You can't do a PhD in common sense yet, and that's all we had. I came to Pondicherry in 1969. At the end of that year, came out to Auroville. I had no background in the life sciences, but having grown up in Tasmania, one's awareness of wildness was very deep. We could see that around here a few hundred years ago, there were forests. The awareness that you can work with the energies of nature, realizing it wasn't an ordinary forestation project. As we saw the sea turn red for 20 kilometers up the coast, like the blood of Auroville, and the canyons getting deeper, you say, well, hang on, are we going to build a city if the foundations are being washed away? That's when that bunding started. We realized we shouldn't be planting trees unless we control the water.
When the rain comes, it should land there and it should stay there. It shouldn't run like it did years before and created the canyons. There should be zero runoff. I started planting trees in 1978 because this place needed trees very much. My name is David. I was born in Brooklyn. I came to Auroville in 1976. I loved being in Auroville. It was an eye-opener. More than an eye, it changed my life forever, I believe. We have a different name, counterculture. A hippie is considered somebody that's not clean, doesn't work, and parties all the time. Something like that. I wasn't like that at all. I worked all the time. I enjoyed working all the time.
Michael came hitchhiking to India when he was 20, and the first time he returned to England was 6 years later with me as a baby. He definitely was an authentic British hippie. He also assisted a lot of the local neighboring Indian farmers to do bunding on their land. Even though they weren't so preoccupied about water conservation and keeping the water from flowing off their land, he would actually go and do bunding for them. And because he was so concerned about the land, he crossed a lot of barriers.
We are on a plateau. Auroville, the highest point is around 50 meters above sea level. And then it slopes down to the ocean. It slopes down to all directions. In the heavy downpours, the soil could not absorb all this moisture anymore. It floats on top and eventually rushes off. You simply had to do, we called it counterbunding. That's preventing the water to flow further down. We had in no time, no more erosion.
The most exciting thing about the bunding work is it's one of the main efforts that Auroville has done that was spontaneously then taken up by all the villagers because they actually saw, oh, I'm not losing all my topsoil, and it really made a big difference.
40 years before, very good rain. That is, you will see the water washing to all the mud, topsoil, then all the water moving to the rivers like that. Then is the monsoon time, is making the bund, and digging the holes and planting.
There's already quite a big environmental awareness in the world in the late 60s. Those days, you were made to feel that you were part of the problem. But to be suddenly offered here an opportunity to be part of the solution, you know, like to not constantly draining the world's resources and destroying the atmosphere sort of thing. Forestry was a very young science. The word ecology had only just been coined. We were sort of refugees from hippiedom, really. It was like an island of odd bods surrounded by a culture that couldn't comprehend who or what we were, really.
They were all hippies. We had, of course, also the more straight people, the French, coming from Paris, who looked sort of slick, you know. They didn't quite associate with us in the Greenbelt. Most of us, we didn't have a degree in land restoration, forestation. It was all self-styled. We learned it as we did it. I'm Diego from Switzerland, and I joined Auroville in '81. We needed water, and in the beginning we only had a borewell with a hand pump. Especially in the Greenbelt, we didn't want to be connected to the grid. So we started to build windmills, Cretan sailcloth windmill. It looked like Stone Age technology. They helped to establish the forest in Auroville. I would climb my windmill every day. Open sails, roll. It was like sailing. We were like on the mast of a big old ship, you know. So it was actually adventurous in a way, especially when a storm came up and you had to go up there to close the sails, you know. 10 years later, about, the metal windmill built in Auroville, that windmill then took over. There's about 20 of them in Auroville, and they still work, you know. The windmill has one advantage. You're pumping water little by little. You don't overcharge the water table.
When Auroville started, it was a man-made desert from the colonial times. The native forest has been entirely cut down. It was extinct. It was cut down by the colonial for the exploitation of the sandalwood and the ebony.
There aren't any textbook techniques on how to turn a desert plateau in this part of South India to a lush tropical dry evergreen forest. There is no handbook. We've had to develop that because of the soil types, the runoff, the monsoon system is so different in any complex ecology. There's no right way to do it.
At some point we discovered that there was a local forest type known as Tropical Dry Evergreen Forest. And we started surveying whatever is left of that forest in the coastal belt of Tamil Nadu.
When we started the quite complex research of the TDEF forest and all that entailed, the trips, the botany and identification of plants, it did correspond to a few people coming with that trained knowledge.
Because when Paul turned up, he said, oh, yeah, right, you guys are doing the right thing, but you're planting the wrong things, you know. You've really got to understand what degrees of shade things require, so we weren't at all scientific. He was definitely an inspiration to work with. We had 7 huge banyans and then one died. And when a tree that size dies, you feel like you've definitely done the wrong thing, you know. Oh, shit, a huge banyan tree, no, you know. He's saying, look, man, trees die, you know.
When I came in 1991, my impressions of the forests were that they were quite vulnerable and that they needed diversity. I was very quickly involved with the native species in this idea of trying to bring those into the Auroville forests. I had studied forestry and ecology, one of my passions. The thing that drew me to Auroville really was the trees and the forest and the opportunity to work in a tropical forest, because that was also part of my childhood dream. And I thought perhaps that I would gain experience and then move on and get a job somewhere else. But in actual fact, I ended up staying because Auroville provided me with the opportunities that I wanted. I was sort of searching for something. Around the 90s, people became very much concerned with the indigenous species. It was the early stages of their work, and so I could very easily join in with them.
We went on weekly trips. We started bringing back plant material and reintroducing all those species into our forest. We surveyed a total of 120 places. And through that, we got a pretty good knowledge of what constitutes a tropical dry evergreen forest.
It was this super hot day in the middle of the summer, and we were walking through this thorny thicket. And we came across this luxuriant green plant. It was just so amazing that this plant in the middle of summer could be evergreen in such arduous conditions. For me, that was the moment that I really understood the extraordinary strength of the species of the tropical dry evergreen forest. Then you really start to understand what the forest in this area would have been like 300-400 years ago.
It's sort of an obscure forest type. It's basically restricted to the coastal belt from the south of Andhra Pradesh down to the tip of Tamil Nadu in the south. It took us many years before we became aware of that. Whatever pockets are left of it are under a lot of pressure.
They surveyed the entire coast of Tamil Nadu to bring back the native species. This is actually an extraordinary work that probably has never been done before us, you know. Such a focused and complete survey. It's an essential work in the reforestation program, you know. They found only some little pieces. little patches here and there around temples, like temple groves.
Not so far from here in Puttapet, there's a little temple forest. Around the temples, they didn't cut the indigenous forest. They had sacred groves, really. Puttapet is the nearest one to here, and it's about, I think originally it was about 50 acres. It might be down to about 30 now. That's where we got a lot of our original seeds.
Paul is going to the Puttapet. I also both stay there, full moon walking, take to the tent, then collecting mainly some seeds. Puttapet is the more than 1,000 years old temple, also old local forest, the middle of the temple, 500 years old, 700 years old, some trees is there. I'm coming to the Auroville, 12 years old, then I will start the forest work. I'm a tall guy, very strong. People thinking I am is 17, 18 years old, but actually I am is 12 years old. Paul and me is living to the fertile, every day coming morning time, so many holes digging, so many trees planting. 35 years before, only planting timber trees, like eucalypt trees and work trees and vangai, teak trees. After Paul will start planting all the different local forest trees.
We came here in 78. This was all empty. There was only one tree in the middle of nowhere. It's still there, a Phoenix sylvestris. We started planting and then it always increased. In the beginning, we had a very big nursery here. And then we started the herbarium in 94. The collections, it's about 15,000 accessions, but it will be about 3,500 different species. In Belgium, if you know 10 species by name, you know almost everything. Here, if you know 100, you know only a part of it. It's much richer.
Because forest trees don't naturally germinate in the full sun, they germinate in the shade. You need shade to proliferate a forest, and so you have to have what they call a pioneering species. You know, we didn't know all this, but this is what sort of happened inadvertently. So we planted lots of acacias, these work trees, and they're Australian and very drought resistant. They're very fast and they created shade very fast. The work tree only has a 15 to 20 year life cycle.
This whole natural flow that it took, and it went through this whole sporadic planting of all sorts of species. But slowly we had this pioneer canopy emerging, which people call the Auroville forest. As a forester, I call it pioneer canopy, but for most people living in Auroville, that's the amazing Auroville forest. And it was that process and that creation of the right environment to then introduce the TDEF. We've introduced 500,000 TDF species in the Auroville forest areas, and they're flourishing, they're surviving the cyclones, they're starting to regenerate.
My name is Dave. I came to Auroville in the end of 2001. What really stands out for me in terms of forest experiences was the impact of the cyclone. The Coromandel coast is very prone to cyclonic activity, and it's likely to get much worse with climate change. One year there was a particularly big cyclone, and then you saw the pioneer species that we're very grateful for, but they're only here for a moment in geological timescales. They broke and they snapped off and they fell over, and yeah, it was carnage for them. The advantage of the indigenous species is they're quite cyclone resistant. So some of them, you could see them bending down to the ground and bouncing right back. So this is what resilience really is.
When you walk through the different forests and you see the TDEF coming up, in some areas they're coming up very nicely, and you see that there's an emerging forest, but it's still a very young forest. Those trees are going to reach maturity in 150 years or something like that.
I think that Auroville really is unique. I guess you could say a divine soup of genetic material, both on the human level as well as on the forest level. Without the genetic material that we keep alive here in Auroville, probably there would be no trace of some of those species in the future, except here. Not only do we have a good number of individuals in any one set of species, but they are able to cross-fertilize and increase the strength of their genetic material, and they're well protected. So you could say we're a seed bank for this very special coastal ecosystem in South India.
That's what the forest really is. It's like this beautiful jewel that the fragments are scattered. We only found certain sets of species in each different remnant, and all the species have been brought here from those different places, and now they're starting to reform that extraordinary forest. It's only when we put the jigsaw back together did we see the beauty of what the tropical dry evergreen forest is. It has an extraordinary future to inspire people.
You go up on the Matu Mandir top, we'll see the all Auroville full looking the trees. Before is the open the land. Now is the very big forest in Auroville. It's very successful.
Auroville is not a contiguous piece of land. Auroville is a patchwork of land that was bought as and when it could be bought. The idea of the green belt was to be the farming and green lungs of the city.
We call it the green belt because we have in the center of Auroville the banyan with the matrimony, and then around that is supposed to be the town area. And in a circle around it is the green belt. But, you know, Auroville doesn't hold all the land, so only a certain amount of land is Auroville land, which was reforested.
The original plan was that Auroville would continuously buy the land till we owned the whole greenbelt. That was the plan. But it faltered for many reasons. Part of it had to do with we got our priorities wrong at many different stages. Buying the land wasn't a high priority when we had the money to do it, and the land was cheap, and so we missed that opportunity, and then the land prices escalated, and so now we're in a position where what was once a flowing tap is now a dripping tap.
With all of this work that we've done, we've actually cut ourselves out of the market. Now we can barely afford it.
The forest group manages land in the city and in the greenbelt. There is 44 places of varying different sizes. The smallest is 4 acres, going up to about 100 acres.
There's areas of a couple of 100 acres of continuous green cover. A lot of the other plantations are fairly isolated. The increased development in and around Auroville makes it more and more impossible to have continuous stretches of forest that prevent us from having this green belt.
Should we start the meeting? Okay. So
There's an umbrella called the Forest Group, and it is a complex group. 44 people that are struggling to maintain land for Auroville. We are an active group in Auroville and probably one of the longest standing groups in Auroville that have kept a certain form and a certain style.
When I was maybe 20 years old, first meeting I went. Which species introduced, where to do the bunding, where can find the seed, the sharing. That's the forest group.
The forest group is a representative group of anybody who stewards or takes care of forests in Auroville. It does meet once a month, and any issues which come up amongst the members is discussed then. Participation tends to be very high, and there's no hierarchy in the group.
Actually, in my house and in principle. Okay, can we...
There's land encroachment issues, there is finance issues, there is interrelationship issues between Auroville and there has to be arbitrations. There's all these elements.
Okay, anybody want to say something about
Somebody once said the forest group is made up of madmen and women and poets, and I would say that's quite apt. Living in the forest a little bit removed from other people allows the space for them to indulge in their own eccentricity, I think. If I look at the forest group, that's as close to, in Auroville speak, divine anarchy as you can get. There's a lot of diversity and some attempt at unity at the same time. We have some rough idea, I think, of what the forests in this area look like, and everybody interprets that differently.
Someone asked me once if there was a forest policy for Auroville, and I said there is no forest policy. It's really about each individual who stewards a piece of land, looking after that land in the way that they see best, And I think that's one of the strengths of the Auroville forest, that it's decentralized, that it's not a single forestry entity that decides what happens in the forests.
We talk about what we're going to do to help our dream come alive. And together we have more strength, and our dreams can, I think, become more powerful and become true. We need to keep it safe, and we need to put our energy into putting it together as a deep, dense, dark forest.
I'm Glenn. I came to Auroville early 90s. By living in the place I'm living now, Anna Sawyer, I gained a connection with certain people that drew me to that work. We can't, in ourselves, look after that fully, so we employ local labour and watchmen, and this is part of the social economic exchange we have with the villages, which is very important if you're trying to protect the forest also, because these people are what give this a connection to outside of Auroville. But this costs money, obviously.
We in the forest who look after the land, we get a regular budget, although it covers about half of the expense you have. The other part, you have to generate yourself with wood sales. For instance, firewood, timber we can sell. We don't do clear cuts. We take out dead wood and sell. So you have to do the work on the land.
Foresters are generating some kind of income, even though it all goes back into the place. We still allocate 10% of that fund to a common pot for the forest group to ensure that we do have some funds for planting each monsoon. This passion to create and protect and develop this forest has been maintained, and for me it's successful only because of that.
I'm Patrick from Revelation Forest, and I came to Auroville in 1984 after having had an experience of living in a community in southern France. And there I discovered Schrobindo and the Mother, so I read a lot of their books. Then I came to Auroville to see, and I stayed. We divide the forest into two types of management criteria: preserve forest and manage forest. The idea of sanctuary, it's a preserved forest. In Revelation, the sanctuary is the zone where the animals came back because it was very quiet and very well protected. The idea of a preserve is to let nature thrive by itself. It's also the recognition that it's the human species that is the problem in the ecosystem. And so we have to restrict ourselves to go in certain forests.
I came to Auroville in 1996. Since I was a child in Los Angeles, I have been almost obsessed with insects. I studied entomology. I think I didn't realize it, but I was searching around for a place where I could freely study the insects. It was the moment I stepped foot into it, I was at home. The whole idea of Auroville, human unity, because it's not just human unity, it's the unity of the planet, really, including insects. Unfortunately, even our oldest forests here are all man-made forests. So even now, they're weak in some ways, and the insects do show us that. They're an indicator. The older the forest gets, the more it can support, and the stronger the whole population of wildlife, including insects, can be. It's good for us as humans to understand the importance of planting a tree, Setting aside land that's strictly for a dense, deep forest is really an important element to the whole area. It's important for our future water, for our future oxygen, and for our future understanding of ways that we're going to be having to change our planet. Foresting is just very important right now to our planet.
The forests depend on the people living in and around them and their consciousness. So hopefully people will appreciate the true value of tree cover. The lifespan of some of these evergreen species are several centuries. The ebony, the mimosops. If there's not a major climatic change and suddenly there's 15 years of drought or a nuclear war or a highway that cuts right through everything, in 100 years, Auroville will be magnificent. A jewel of the country.
Am I on? Yeah. Well, I hope you had your forest experience. For those who haven't had chance to walk around, I'm still very touched when I watch that movie, and it's very hard to speak afterwards. But I will try. I think if you watch that movie, one thing you can gain from that when you've seen how it all started, how actually some of us can be seen to be slightly attached to our green cover when it comes to development. There's reasons. It's not any fanatical response that we're having. It's purely what we've done and what people have done in the past to give us this environment that we can now so easily take for granted. So I will come back. I'll bring us a little bit down to earth. That was a little bit sort of like very atmospheric. So Auroville Forest Group. Okay, so it's working. So the Forest Group, it was mentioned, we're 80 people that are working together. We're quite highly diverse. I think we're 17 different nationalities working together. We have a 3-to-1 gender balance, and we work together and in a very harmonious way. We manage a lot of land for Auroville. We have a big responsibility in that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's broken down, especially this will come in for the planning. We'll have to sit down and get on the nitty-gritty. 62% of that land that we manage is actually in the Greenbelt area. 15% is in the outlying areas, and as you can see there, 23% is actually in the city. Not all of that is actually planted in with, I wouldn't say forests. There is quite large tracts of forest group managed land in the city that's being managed as woodland ready to be passed over to the different zones. One area that I personally manage is in the cultural zone, quite a vast area. Most people think it's Gaia Forest, that whole area between Town Hall and Gaya Security, Surrender and Kalabumi. That whole area is managed by the forest group, but it's just being maintained, ready for it to be taken over and developed into the cultural zone. Next. That gives you an idea of the way the land is spread out. Just for reference points, in purple is the villages around Auroville. In the top, it's Raipettai, Alankupam, Aninaga, then Kodakrai below it, and then Edi and Chavadi. Next. So we've seen, I think we just absorbed what the Auroville forests are. I mean, sometimes it's even hard to put words to it, but it is a result of 50 years hard work. When Auroville came, it was an eroded, barren plateau. It's become a biodiversity hotspot, and I think that that's a very, very important aspect. It's a large area with good proven restoration techniques, so it's a good way of putting that out to the world, how this can be done. It's probably one of the largest contiguous areas of TDEF forests that we know. Having studied it, we don't see anything of this nature. It's obviously a habitat for all sorts of things, not only the plants. The birds have come back, the mammals have come back. We have all sorts of things that are appearing that we don't know where they manage to survive. We have problems even. We have porcupines eating away our forests. But as Jana said in that last part of it, we have pollinators, we have insects, and it's actually the pollinators which are quite critical, not just for a forest, but for humans, because unless there's a place for the pollinators to survive, farms do not work. Agroforestry does not work anymore. So this is really an important element. Obviously, we are the lungs of Auroville and probably a little bit the region. We create a microclimate. I don't know if now you've had chance to go outside of Auroville and then come back up the plateau in the evening. You clearly see we have a different climate. As soon as you hit for Chandikulam Bridge, we're putting our jackets on, even this time of the year. We're protecting the watershed. And I think as Paul said, it's a place of inspiration. And I think many people said that along the way. Auroville, people come here, whether it be tourists, whether it be students, whether it's people who have businesses and industry and work in all sorts of elements, they come back and they get inspired and they can take that with them. We're working with a lot of people, and this work that we're doing is spreading out personal projects, whether it be with people's private land or whether it's on hotel complexes, whether it's resorts on the beach, whether it's industrialists who want their land reclaimed after they've done the damage of extracting resources. All these elements, it's inspiring when they come here because they can see it can be done, because there isn't so many projects where you can actually see many things manifesting in quite short space of time. Next. Next. Okay. So what's our responsibility? Mainly it's land protection. I mean, most of the work that was done at the beginning was to protect the borders, protect the land. Obviously, it had been bought. There was not only people to encroach, there is animals to graze it. So we still maintain that, and that is still very present now. A lot of our work that we do as foresters is to protect and secure the land for Auroville. Then soil and water conservation. It's the unseen work of Auroville, actually. Most people come here and they don't understand that. You've seen it on the movie, you've seen what Auroville looked like before, so it's very clear that without that work, none of this would have happened. And most people I say, when I meet them from outside, and they say you don't see that, but when you're going around on your motorbike or your cycle and you're getting back pain over all these speed breakers that are constantly on all our red roads, and it's actually not to break the speed, and that they're part of this soil and water conservation grid, which is extensive, and it spreads out. We have to stop the water running, and we still have to work on that. Afforestation that you've seen on the movie, I don't need to talk about that. Planting, management. It's not just that we plant a tree and forget it. We have quite a vibrant environment where we plant, so there is competition. So we plant, but after that you need to maintain. Luckily, what we're planting now doesn't need water. Occasionally in a bad season, we might have to put once or twice some buckets of water on during the year, but it's not extensively watered. It's drought resistant because it's the native species. But there are species that come and they compete. So a lot of the work that is spent in our forests on a daily level is keeping the area free from invasive species that are growing and pushing down just to allow this forest to come up as fast as we can get it. And then you've seen how much land we have. Obviously, we have a responsibility to the community, so we do a lot of reporting. We meet once a month. We discuss our issues that we have in the group, whether it's land technique management, allocation of land, what we're going to do in the future. That's reported on a monthly level, and we account for all our expenditures, the money we get from Auroville, the money we generate in the forest themselves, and our personal investments. That's all accounted for through the BCC and the FAMC. Next. So now we're pretty much heading for that top one. That's our main priority. Obviously, we know what we're doing now, but still we have to create sanctuary areas. We have to protect watershed areas which are very sensitive. They need different species because they're flooded. We still have to protect the canyons and new areas that are bought. We need buffer zones around any of the watercourses, so we have to maintain those. We've created urban forestry areas in the parks. I think our parks are starting to take form now and using all the same species that we're using in the forest, but we use them in the parks because they're very beautiful. Even people now, as I said, we're doing projects outside, they suddenly have found a whole set of species that they can work with that they didn't realize they could. They're readily available in Auroville, but so rare to find outside. So they're all in our parks, whether they're landscaped or formal, informal, waiting to become formal. And timber stands in a bid to try and be certainly sustainable in a small amount. Firewood production. As Diego said in the movie, we never cut green trees. We do sometimes prune our green trees if they're interfering with the plantations. But so far, we've been surviving in most areas with the work tree, with the Acacia riculifolium, dying naturally, being harvested, and then that money being invested back in the forest. Last but not least, a bit of agroforestry goes in the forest group, but not that much because we also have farms. I mean, how land is actually allocated, or in the history of Auroville it's been allocated, and we still apply that. When land is acquired, bought, given to Auroville, depending on where it is in its zone, it's obviously now different because there are maps now, but then there wasn't maps. If the soil was very fertile, it would be given to the farm group. If there was no topsoil, it was very eroded, the forest group would get that to work on. So it was a very clear define. We wouldn't start doing forests on agricultural land. We keep that for agriculture. Next. So let's go to the TDEF, something that was all happening when I first came at the beginning of the 90s. This study you've seen on the map, it's a very narrow patch of forest, and it's Champion Seth, botanist, divided India up into many forest types. It's there, it's an existing forest type, but actually when we look at it, it doesn't exist anymore. It's a very narrow belt, and with the sea on the one side, and as you go inland towards Jinji, Tindivanam side, it becomes a different forest type. It becomes a deciduous forest, which actually loses its leaves during the summer period, which actually when I think about it, we were quite lucky because suddenly we have an indigenous forest. We have native species, which is the way the world is going. We can work with those, and they're evergreen, which means we have all year round shade. So we've got a real win-win situation here. If Auroville was slightly inboard, we would have been struggling for shade in the summer if we had gone native, literally. Next. I think it was mentioned 95% of this is cleared, but actually if you look into the calculations and you look at you do the analysis of the remnants, of that 5% that's left, only 5% of the 5% is left, because the 95% of the 5% is actually disturbed in some way. It's a scrub jungle with some regrowth in. It's been a reserve forest that's been utilized for economic forestry, revenue generating, or experimental forestry. No fault being given, it's just different ways of the world working. But basically we're down to about 0.2% of its original cover, which is pretty critical as far as a forest type goes. I think in 98, 99, I can't remember the date. Anyway, we had a workshop in Pachandikulam after we did a certain project of all the botanists in South India, and we had a big argument because they said the TDEF doesn't exist anymore, it's extinct forest type. For me, that was really a crucial point. And there was Joss there, and Paul was there, and Yap, and Walter, and a few others. And we argued, no, we have enough information. We can save this forest, and we can go to work on it. And I think that that's what we did from that point. The existing 5% that I'm talking about of the 5%, which is the 2%, 0.2%, exists mainly in sacred groves. And that's a religious, cultural fact that has actually saved the forest. These temples have normally these temple groves have a small temple with a forest around. That's how it is with these Ayana coils, these Shiva coils in South India. Next. So when we went there 25 years ago, we were doing all this sort of exploration, seed gathering, and that's how we put together this profile of this forest. We visited about 75 to 80 sites then. Now I'm involved in a project where we're revisiting these. We've revisited 60 in the last 6 months to just do a checkpoint. Where are we at? Where is this TDEF? And it's not looking very good. I would say 25% next. 25% of those, I'm going a bit ahead of myself, but 25% of those sacred groves are in good condition. They're static. They are preserved. They're being protected. They have a lot of, for whatever reason that might be, different reasons. I won't go into it now. But the other 75% are feeling the pressure. I think by the nature of a sacred grove, they're never expanding because they're temple land. Temple land doesn't get, to my knowledge, it doesn't get expanded on. It's got its limits. So if that gets a little bit encroached, or if people start to cut wood in there, or if they start to take firewood from there, they lop and cut, suddenly the canopy gets reduced. And that's what we're seeing in 75% of these groves. The study isn't yet complete. It will be formalized, hopefully in the next 6 months. This is an example of some species, actually. You won't get to know any of these species. You know the ebony. In that whole strip from Chennai down to Karakal, there's only 25 sites that we see that, and sometimes they're single species, one species of tree. The particular thing with this Diospyros ebony is it's a dioecious species, so it needs male and female plants. So in some groves, it's present, but it's not regenerating. I went to a grove a few months ago, and actually all the mature ebonies were gone. And there was just a little bit of regrowth. They got hit by Cyclone Tani. So even these, and I took this random set just to get an idea for myself. I don't try and mess with figures. So there are some species, that the Garcinia, it's quite prominent along the coast, but still only 26 sites out of the 60 it's found. I digress a little bit. What I found was very interesting is, I think just before the monsoon, our last study, we're studying a small temple grove down on the ECR road, quite close to Auroville. And we went through all the papers, and the Diospyros ebony, which is the one that a lot of focus goes on these days, it had gone from that forest. It wasn't there anymore. It didn't exist. We'd been going back there, and we didn't see it. We went back there, and I started to see seedlings of that appearing in the sacred grove, which initially I couldn't understand why it was missed, but then I realized there's no mature specimens there. It wasn't missed. That's regenerating from Shakti forest, which was planted by Walter. So now what we're seeing, which is quite a convoluted sort of thing that's happening, is we're actually seeing species that are growing in Auroville forest regenerating in sacred groves, which is quite amazing, actually, I find. Anyway, next. That's what I just spoke about. So let's move on. You'll get a copy of this presentation, so you don't need to write the facts and figures down. So in the last 20 years, in total, I mentioned in the movie when I said we've planted 500,000 TDF species. Obviously, it's a passion of ours. And in the last 20 years, this is what's happening. We got really excited at the beginning. There was lots of land. As we started to work through the forest and plant it, obviously, you can see there's definitely a trend that we're doing less and less nowadays. The diversity is going up. That's the diversity of the forest, and that's the actual seedlings. Okay, in 2011, when we had the cyclone, we definitely had a peak in 2012. Suddenly there was a big area again available to plant. But again, we slowly went down, and it's pittering around about 15,000. But still, we're working with particular species, the rarer species, introducing the species we haven't already got established. In fact, our focus has become completely on evergreen forest at the moment, because the TDEF does contain certain species of non-evergreens, but now we're really concentrating on the importance of the evergreen canopy. Next. So let's get to some nitty-gritty, as I call it. This is the map of Auroville. The green is forest group managed land. The white is the balance of the land managed by different groups and coordination. Even the white land in the green belt is probably the farm group, not all of it, because in the green belt there are developed residential communities. Certitude is in the green belt, Samasti is in the green belt, Sharanga is in the green belt, Dana is in the green belt. So we have these residential areas harmoniously living amongst us in the green belt. And that's the road grid. I think what's important, what I put this up is, though the city is being consolidated, personally, and I think it's the thought of many people, the chances of ever consolidating the green belt, it's a dream, of course, but we have to be realistic. You've got an expanding village here. You've got Alankupam. That little yellow bubble there is Pondicherry land. So that's Pondicherry land, which is like, forget buying Pondicherry land. So expensive. You've got the village, Alankupam, as I mentioned, Raipeta, Aninaga, Kodakarai. But it's not just a village. We have to accept that there's a land need in these villages. This area here, we haven't got Kulapaliam, which is starting there. We haven't got that in the green belt, but what we've got here is this huge area. This is known as it's a hardcore agricultural zone for Kulapaliam. We've never made any impact. You can see we've got one plot in the middle there and one there. They're not interested. It's land that's really needed for agriculture. It's land it's ancestral land. It's there. So we've got 35% of the green belt, and I'm not sure we're going to get much more, personally. So I think we have to act as if that is the case for the next decades and value what we have, especially the green spaces. Next, I'm nearly done, sorry. Hotspots. So as planners and developers, you've got now quite a responsibility. We've got a lot of faith that this is going to be done consciously. You've seen what Auroville was. It never was an empty canvas. It was an eroded desert. It did have topography. It did have villages, but now it's got 50 years of work on top of it. So yeah, we have sensitive areas. I'm not listing here all the sensitive areas because a lot of them are also residential areas which are not necessarily forest group concerns. I won't list them. You can go through these. We can go through them together afterwards. But basically, we've got areas on the Crown Road and the proposed outer ring road which are really sensitive. Next. We've got this area here, which is the revelation. You've seen Patrick walking around this forest. You've seen Dave in silence. All these areas are on this supposedly proposed outer ring road. So when we're approaching this, I'm hoping that you keep that in mind, that we take this very sensitively. It's something that we've got to do very carefully because it's not just a few trees that can be cut. We're talking about ecology here. We're talking about 50 years of work. Next. Another zone, one of the largest contiguous areas of forest we've got on the east side. That's a small part of Anasoya, mainly at Samridi, Gaya and Meadow. Again, same scenario. We've got to deal with this. Next. We have to deal with it very carefully. What's up and coming and probably going to be your first challenge is this area here, Darkali. The Crown Road goes through that. You'll see a huge water catchment that's been built and is fully functioning right on the middle of the Crown. So it hasn't been yet cleared. So luckily, maybe we can get a chance to look at that in a bit more detail. There has been a proposal there. There is space for maneuvering. We've got to work on this together and find solutions. Now is a chance, big responsibility, I think. Next. Aurodam. I think the line of goodwill has been mentioned. This again has got to be done very carefully, very sensitively. This is the Aurodam watershed. This is what it looks like during the monsoon. Next. Small forests. They're not only, we've got little areas like here. There's a radial going across Centerfield. It's a very small forest, but it's very rich and diverse. That's just behind, quite close to Solar Kitchen, and it falls on a radial. Next. an evergreen forest. Again, another radio straight through the middle of it. We've got the black lines I forgot to tell you on these maps are existing tar roads, government roads. Next. So now we come to this is a map of actually the road system on the residents approved master plan from 1999. I was at the meeting, and I can tell you these issues that we're talking about that I'm highlighting now, they're not new. We discussed these at that meeting, and it was one of the reasons when the master plan, we all understood it needed to be ratified. We needed to accept a plan for Auroville. It was mainly done for land protection reasons. There was definitely a reason for doing it. But there was a lot of concern at that meeting. I was there, very present, and very verbal also, about this sort of scenario of how we can do this very carefully. And then there was this agreement, as you can see on this map, road to be considered. So that whole area actually was marked, and this is what the residents of Auroville actually agreed upon. Obviously, things moved forward, it was changed for whatever reason, and it got gazetted, so now that road is marked in. But still, we're a community. We have a flexibility. The master plan in itself gives us that flexibility. Next. So on that, I would like to thank you for your attention. And any questions, if there's any time left, I can give you. If not, I can come to another moment and meet you all. I'm open to that and clarify anything. There was talk of walking through some of these areas, Revelation, Samriti. I think they can be arranged, but I think you've got an idea from the movie, but you can always contact the organizers and we can see if we can arrange that for you.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you
for sharing your knowledge and experience. And thank you for bringing in the voices also of so many other foresters through the film.
I couldn't bring them all here now.
Is there any collaboration between the farm group and the forest group currently, or would that be?
There is a collaboration in the fact that there is an umbrella of the two, the farm group and the forest group, and actually it's the umbrella called the green group, and that's the official group that normally represents us if it's land allocation or for the FAMC. So there is an umbrella group which is members of the two groups, and so there is an interaction. But mainly we don't need to meet because it's quite clear the farms are managed on a different level of land use. We never fight over land. Normally what happens is when it's put down and we look at the land and it's very clear if it's for the forestation project or if it's for farming. So that does happen, and that normally happens at the green group level. I think there is a collaboration, and that is an existing group. But we generally are not working together like on a monthly level. It's something that happens when it needs to happen, and we generally work together. Thank you.
Hi, Glenn. Thank you for the presentation. My thoughts are, have you considered transplanting trees in any context in history, in the foresting history of Auroville, and is there any person in the forest group that has experience in doing that?
Transplanting trees, we've never had the need to transplant trees. We've tried it a few times. There was a scenario where the Crown Road went through the area that I'd been stewarding, and I tried very carefully not to plant trees. I tried very hard not to plant trees. But trees do regenerate. So there were some trees there, and we did try to transplant them because we had worked our way through, following the right-of-way, but they were not successful because the problem with the tropical dry evergreen forest is they're drought-resistant trees, and for that reason they have very strong tapping roots, water roots, so the roots go down very, very hard. The moment you cut them, a big tree will really suffer. It's not impossible, and we are experimenting with it. Islan himself has actually wrote a project with 2 other people, and they've actually designed and made a tree transplanter for small trees. So when the scenarios happen, I think certain small trees can be transplanted, but you can't transplant an ecosystem. So you might be able to plant individual trees, but you can't move a forest from one place to another. Next.
I had a question about...
hi.
Hi. I had a question about fruit trees, because
just something that we relate to, everybody relates to, something that is edible, natural.
Okay.
And the diversity in fruits is also decreasing as you see in the market over the different years.
Yeah.
And where do these stand in your priority? Like, I was just wondering, because even in the dream catching sessions years ago, in our dreaming at that time, I had also come up at that time and let's have these fruit trees where, you know, food is available to everybody anytime. And you know, this now we've seen the mangoes, but in any other fruits, we don't need to go buy from the shelves. They're all around, even for our children growing, they grow with the trees. So I was wondering how, if that is considered and if that is in the plan, if not now, then in the future, how is it seen?
Okay, fruit trees need very good soil and good shade, and the ones that we do have are the ones that generally are appropriate. I think you have to, I think I have to respect when I say this, is that the foresters have tried, the farmers have tried everything. They've tried to plant pomegranates, they've tried to plant all of trees, but certain amount of trees, fruit trees survive and certain don't. If you've got to put a huge amount of water in, then it becomes unsustainable to plant them. So we do plant fruit trees, but that's the farmers. The farmers do that, but I don't know if you've noticed, there is a set of trees. There's papayas, there's mangoes, there's romfol, there's a whole lot, and they're very seasonal. So what happens is, everyone has them in their garden. So what happens is in the season, and if you go to Portus or PTDC or wherever, suddenly at the season, there's piles of mangoes in the Auroville grown fruit stands from all the Auroville farms, but no one's buying them because everyone is growing them themselves in their gardens. So I think in the forest we don't need to put fruit trees because I think the farm group have got it covered, and I think in the residential areas people have got it covered. And you need soil and you need sun, and that's obviously
That's not part of the forest biodiversity requirement?
Fruit trees. I mean, there is certain fruit trees within the TDEF, but I don't think many people enjoy amla and some of the trees we have there, the Diospyros, they're edible fruits. So there's definitely no place for hybrid fruit trees in the biodiversity, no. But in our biodiversity, there are edible fruits. Abiram has planted a whole fruit farm, forest fruit area in Sadhana Forest, for instance. So it does exist, but they're small fruits. They're not marketable. They're edible fruits. But so as you can see, we're trying to go native, and there isn't many native fruit trees, and mango does that here. So, and if we were to experiment, I think it's more on the farmland than in the forests because we're talking conditions.
Yes, thank you, Glenn, for the presentation. I have a sharing to make with the Dreamweaving team about the concept of the green belt, because the concept of the green belt initially comes from the Howard Gardner and the Garden City movement, and its main aim was to control the size of a city. So it was a way of the biomorphic school of planning, or the, let's say, organicism in planning, came with this concept that the elephant is not the magnification of the ant. They are very different scale, and the character of a city of that scale is very different than the character of a city of that scale. So how to control the size of the city not to grow more than this comes the concept of the green belt. Then the concept of the green belt rarely works. It was found again and again that it rarely works. The reason is that anytime there is development on one edge and development inside, it increases the value of the land, and then the land is developed and it keeps eroding. But in the rare cases in which it worked, it was actually the finger solution, in which it is not only the green belt around, it goes to the center. And this is one of the reasons I said in the last lecture, the importance of the continuity of the ecosystem is that if you do, and this is the very big recommendation for the team, whenever there is a crown passing by and there are all of these fingers going to the center, it is very important to maintain the continuity of the experience and the continuity of the ecosystem. Otherwise, the whole green belt has a less chance of working.